Let's see how many we want to get back on the schedule. Right. We will show maybe half of them. Okay, Bruce is at next at in 4 minutes, but we'll take a little more time than that. But we don't want to eat up too much time. We just want to get out of here by 5:30 with the schedule. I think ends around 5. Okay, next slide. No, okay, this is the basics of grazing occultations. I already talked about that. And that. Okay, and also talked about that. So okay, we can go on and then in 1964, well, if you go back in 1964, that was, I was just starting grazes in 1963 or 62 is when I first did the very first things, but the first successes were in 63. And then in 64, Watts charts were published in the marginal zone of the moon. And this article was published in Sky and Telescope. And it just happened, it was in the February issue, and we had a graze that time that happened to be in the one chart that they showed. And so I knew that there was a high mountain that was going to cover our profile for that graze. It was interesting. But at least we had some charts of the zone of the edge of the moon that we used before it was complete shot in the dark. So we've relied on these, of course, for many years. Next slide. Okay, this shows, since we're on July 12th now, and yesterday we were at the lunch or dinner. That was only about the second dinner that where Joan and I weren't together on our anniversary. So the other time was I was in Russia and she had to come back here for something, but I had to stay there to get my pay check. Oh yes, yeah, definitely. Or it sort of says the things there, but from left to right, here's Tom Van Flandern. He was best man, and he worked at the Naval Observatory on the, on the grazes and the analysis and so forth. And he actually worked mostly on the total lunar occultations. And Ron Abelia, this who was just a student, did actually the most of the graze analysis while he was doing his actually undergraduate studies in Missouri. So he knew Bob Sandy. But here's Homer DeBoll here. Um, so, and then next to him is Ed Halbach. Ed Halbach is the president of the Milwaukee Astronomical Society. And he talked them into building this cable system where they got cable from the local telephone company and set up a 2-mile long cable with push buttons. And they also got a 21 pen recorder. So they had one pen that they had with it was driven from WWV time signals, and then the other 20 were the 20 stations on this line. And they also developed these little handy 10-inch telescopes. They'd be great for asteroid occultations. We ought to get some of them. But they were sort of early, Dobsonians, but they were actually that sort of design, although it was before the Dobsonians became popular. And but they used them for grazes then in their club, and did there was quite a bit of activity, and IOTA really got, we had a lot more people involved because it's sort of unfortunate now we have fewer people, but we have as many stations because we're using all these remote deployments and different things. And it's less of a group activity, whereas with grazes it had to be a group activity where people would get together because you were spread out over only 2 or 3 miles. And so it was sort of a different culture than we have now where you're spread out over the whole state, and things. And so, but anyway, grazes still occur, and there's still some interest in doing it, and so I'm trying to encourage that. Of course, I didn't say at the end, of course, myself and Joan. So we were young and pretty. Anyway, and this was in Highland Park, Joan's home. Right. Yeah, we'd actually borrowed the cable, and 2 nights before there was a graze, and we were unfortunately rained out on in central Illinois. But Homer DeVol brought the cable down, and I joined him. I was living in St. Louis at the time, and then all joined together here at the wedding. Next slide. And then as far as Beta 2 Capricorni that I saw back in 1957, I finally got my revenge on that star with the grays that we predicted that was just north of Richmond. Then it was after we moved here in 1976. Joan and I moved to Maryland. And in spite of the conditions, the events were easy to see. The star's third magnitude, but these were visual observations then. And IOTA had just formed a couple of years before that. Next slide. This shows the profile during the grays, showing how, again, this just shows we had quite a few more stations and developed this profile, showing plotting time relative to the time of central grays for each observer versus the observer's different distance from the northern limit, showing in miles on the right and seconds of arc at the moon's distance on the left. And the Watts chart's points are these little dots here. But the important thing to remember in all of these plots of grays is that the vertical scale is exaggerated by a factor of about 50 to 1 over the horizontal scale. So the moon isn't that craggy and everything. That the features are really much more gentle because if the horizontal axis were at the same scale as the vertical, this would extend over the whole length of the building and then some. So. Next slide, to the next building, okay. Next slide. No, there are two other previous grazes where video camera was used by, TV station people. This was the first time, that we actually, the Naval Observatory got this really expensive Ultracon camera. Cost over $1,000, which is a lot of money back then. And I went and hit the bucket and bought one myself, and that was the first private one. But I didn't have it myself by then. But Al had it, and so I said, well, why don't you come with us and do this great? He got it for solar eclipse work, but we set it up on Mark Trueblood's telescope. He had some other function he couldn't go to, and so he loaned us his scope. And so we set it up with Al Fiala, and Al Fiala ran it successfully. And they got 7. That was the first time we got multiple events. The other two earlier ones were just 1D and 1R were recorded. But here we actually got 7 Ds and 7 Rs, so it's quite exciting. And so finally show people what these things look like. But next slide. Oh. Next slide. Okay, so we'll show videos later. Let's just go on to the next one. This is a nice Aldebaran graze that was done a few years ago. And multiple stations were first used for grazing occultations in the late 1980s. But we'll go on and I'll talk more about multiple stations later. But for grazes, you had to track because you had a narrow field of view. So it's a little different than for asteroid occultations where we pre-point. So we'll go on to the next slide. You can download these things and look at them more to learn some more things. But this particular graze was a nice bright star with a crescent moon well on the dark side. So it was beautiful. The first day of winter was at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, which is a big summer place. So we went there and we had the place to ourselves. It was nice, easy place. It wasn't a weekend. So we had 4 video stations were unattended and 4 manned stations. Next slide. Yeah, well, it's nothing like what it's when it is in Moscow. That is there. So anyway, those A, B, and C show the remote stations that I ran, and then the other stations were further south. Next slide. This shows the 3 telescopes which I showed before that were used on that event. And this one actually was pre-pointed. The middle one was just a camcorder, and so I did pre-point it, but I just saw the field where the moon was, and I saw it was going to drift across, and so I just set it a little bit ahead, and it worked. And it recorded more events than any other station. Next slide. And this just shows the different chords for this grays and the observers in Georgia who got several too. This is just a computer plot. Next slide. Okay, next slide. We talked about these can be used for grazes too, and so next slide. Okay, I'll go and I think we'll stop with this here, and I'll pick this up when I talk to